project was explaining the LGBTQ and what all those letters meant, and a few others. To start out, how many of you know what asexuality, transgender, and pansexuality are? Okay. Well, not as many of you know as I would hope, and that's why I did this presentation. Asexuality is somebody who has no sexual orientation. They don't find any kind of sexual attraction to either sex or any other sex. A transgender is a blanket term, meaning anybody who doesn't fall into the gender binary. People who would identify as transgender would be gender fluid, gender queer, non-binary, or agender. Pansexuality is, in a way, is kind of like bisexuality, but bisexuality only, how do I explain this? It only applies to male or female, and then pansexuality is male, female, both, or neither. That's just how it is. What is the LGBTQ, and explaining sexuality and gender orientation? My basic question was, what is this? Because it actually all started from, I was at a friend's house, and his sister went on this completely rude rampage about how pansexuality doesn't exist and how they're just really confused. And I was terribly offended for people that I know that are pansexual. And so her ignorance inspired me to do a senior project on it. And along with her, I found out that a lot of people in our school don't understand or know about different sexual orientations other than gay or lesbian, and male or female gender identities. And that's just, there's so much more than that. And it became really important because in this time period, it's becoming a lot bigger of an issue because of the whole gay pride and gay rights movement thing going on. And so I figured it would be important to explain what's all part of that. What I learned from the noted bibliography stuff was I read a whole bunch of websites, and it helped me narrow down what I wanted to talk about because I wanted to explain a wide range of terms, not just the LGBTQ. What I actually explained was the LGBTQQIIAA, which is the lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, transsexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intergender, intersex, ally, and agender. No, asexual. And I learned all that from different websites that kind of use that to explain most of them because a lot of those terms are blanket terms that apply to more than just one thing. I also learned about a whole new range of pronouns because when we think of pronouns, we think of he, him, or she, her. And gender-neutral pronouns could be they or them, or it or its, which is kind of derogatory sometimes, but it's based on preference. But what I learned was there are new pronouns that people have created to apply to gender-neutral pronouns so that people don't have to say they, them. And so I talked in my presentation about like nim or ner, which is a combination of he or she pronouns, and it's just a mashup between them. And it's nim and ner and nemself, and then vir and ver and themself. And those are just gender-neutral pronouns that somebody might want to identify by, but it's not very common for them to just because they have to explain every time what it means. Important points that I found throughout my research is there's no such thing as a light switch with sexuality and gender orientation. Everything to do with this topic is a spectrum. There's no one or the other. And if somebody comes up to you, well, I mean, no one would do this, but if somebody comes up to you and says, I'm genderqueer, you can't really be like, no, you're not. You're gender fluid. It doesn't work like that. Don't try to tell people how they feel about their own body. And then I already explained the pronoun point. I just learned about a whole bunch of different pronouns. And I was actually talking with a friend of mine about transgender. And they were dating a guy that was a male to female transsexual. And they would go out and eat dinner, and the waiter would comment on, they would present him as a female or use female pronouns, and he would politely correct them. And the waiter would then act like he was offending him. And something you have to remember is if somebody corrects you on their pronouns, they aren't being mean or rude about it. They're honestly just trying to get you to tell the right thing. And if somebody tells you that they identify by a different pronoun, please respect that. It's not really an option, in my opinion. I think it's rude and immoral to be like, no, I'm not going to call you that. My directed audience was students of MPHS as well as educators. At the presentation, I had 2 teachers as well as like 20 students show up. This picture was before everybody got there. I had students and teachers, and I had a few of my other friends that don't go to the school even showed up to this presentation. Because the whole point of my senior project was to explain what it all meant to this particular school, because we have a large LGBTQ community in the school, and I feel like not very many people know about it, and so I just wanted to bring that to light. Yeah, I already explained that, because I actually had a teacher that didn't know her student was transgender until I had mentioned it, and they were like, are you serious? They never corrected when I used she, her pronouns, and I was like, yeah, he probably just didn't feel comfortable at that point in time. And she was like, well, dang. But I think it's really important, and for teachers, if they don't know a student's pronouns, the best thing they can do is ask, because I don't think anybody would be offended if they just walked up and said, hey, what are your personal pronouns? And it's actually extremely polite, and somebody who's transgender will love that teacher forever if they use the correct pronouns. No. So what did I do? I made an educational presentation, and I essentially explained all of those terms that I said earlier in a presentation. And I invited pretty much anybody who wanted to come, and I was surprised by the turnout because I did a Facebook group and invited a bunch of people, and a lot of people just didn't get back, but a lot more showed up than I had originally expected. And I talked with a friend, and they came in and discussed what their personal experience with transgender identification was. And that was a really good idea because, I mean, it's one thing to read about it and study it, but it's a whole other thing to experience it. And they lived through it, and so they came in and told their coming out story and how they found out that they were transgender. And it was just extremely nice of them. And then here's pictures of the presentation. We actually had a lot of trouble trying to get it to work because we didn't know the key had to be plugged in or turned. And so we spent like 20 minutes trying to get the projector to work. But Ms. Heft and Mrs. Lunsford were there, and Heft is actually the advisor of the GSA, and with my presentation, she actually learned a whole lot, which I was really happy about because she did her own personal study points or time on these topics, and afterwards, she as well as a lot of other people walked up and said, I didn't know a lot of that. And so I was pretty happy about that, because I wanted to bring out certain things that people wouldn't know about. So it was just a really good feeling that people walked up and was like, hey, that helped me a lot, and I understand this a lot better now. What did I learn? Like people at the presentation, I thought I knew quite a bit, and I ended up not knowing that much when it became a broad topic. Because I was like, oh yeah, basic terms, which I later found out that the basic terms are the tip of the iceberg, and everything has so many topics underneath every different letter. I talked about pronouns. Coming out is extremely difficult for everybody. Coming out's never fun, and honestly what I learned was basically to be supportive. If somebody comes out to you, don't out them. If they aren't comfortable with it, don't talk about it. They're people, they aren't, how do I explain this? They aren't gay, they're human, and you need to treat them as such. I also learned about pride flags, which I didn't know, because this is the gay pride flag. I thought that was pretty much it. I thought it represented the whole LGBTQ, which isn't accurate at all. Pride flags have, well, every one of those letters has its own pride flag, which in my presentation I made a point to show because with coming out, you think you're going to be alone and you're not, which is kind of what I found out because I always thought that the LGBTQ community in the US was really small, but it's a lot larger than I expected because I read a study that says about 1 in 5 people like the same sex from this national study in like 2013. I also learned about support. There's entire websites, blogs, phone lines that are all about support if you're trying to come out, and a huge point in the presentation was that you're never alone, and I don't know, I guess the whole presentation fell under it's okay, which is important. And so that was my presentation. A lot of people thought it was a good idea, and I personally feel pretty proud about it. This was important because it applies directly to me, and I know a lot of people in the LGBTQ community, as well as I'm a part of it. And honestly, the whole me having to explain every single topic to each individual person who just doesn't listen to me the first time makes me mad. And so the presentation was to explain in more simple terms what everything meant and how it applies to you guys. And that's the end of the presentation.
As part of the rubric that Avery constructed for us, he asks for comprehension, so he's looking for 3 to 4 questions specifically based on his project.
Yeah.
What's A plus stand for?
Plus is anything that's not in this.
Oh, okay.
This covers most of it, but there's still a lot more, like agender. That's not part of the spectrum, but it falls under transgender. But people who are agender will not most often identify as transgender.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Could you quickly go over the difference between bisexual and pansexual again?
bisexual applies to somebody who likes male or female. They don't listen, well, okay, bisexual people will like a male and female, either romantically, sexually, mentally, physically. Whereas a pansexual will like male, female, somebody who identifies as they, them, or gender neutral pronouns, which would mean they would like male, female, or a combination of both in one person, or somebody who identifies as neither. So basically, they like somebody who identifies as he, him, her, she, or they, them. Yeah.
When it comes to a lot of ignorance or controversy based on topics like this, or race relations, or you can think about abortion topics, or a lot of different topics that kind of create a lot of high paradigm shifts within people. How do you best break down some of those barriers to create a create an experience where people can have a back and forth kind of a Q&A, an honest back and forth Q&A, without creating animosity? Because sometimes what happens is, in any of these topics, people have a large paradigm shift to make, okay? And to make that shift, there has to be some questions that are asked that can sometimes seem offensive. But how do you create that situation in which you can just have an open understanding Q&A session without leading to any sort of hurt feelings or animosity that even continues to be created?
That's a really good question. To prevent animosity, I would say, like, don't sound snotty when you're trying to ask a question, because I can speak from personal experience. When you come out, it's extremely, extremely emotionally damaging on you. It's not a good feeling, because you just feel absolutely awful. And at the same time, you feel relief. And people will be like, oh, so you're gay now? It's like, I'm not gay now. I've always been gay. And I always will be gay. But how I would prevent that was just don't sound snotty. And I would say, keep an open mind. If somebody says, I am gender fluid, and gender fluidity is where somebody would identify as male one day, but female the next day, because it kind of goes back and forth. If somebody says that, I wouldn't respond with, well, isn't that the same thing as non-binary? Because a non-binary identifies as male and female, or neither. I guess the whole thing just boils down to be understanding, and don't try to push your personal beliefs into somebody else's sexuality or gender orientation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you're representing the
LGBTQ, for
We
sure.
usually refer to that as the alphabet soup, and people can see why now, but you're representing that community a lot, but would you say that in that conversation where you're trying to teach people who don't know about it, that it's also important to consider those people who you're teaching, like the fact that if they're really trying, they're not being ignorant because they want to be, they just don't know, and it's important to consider that.
I think there's a difference between wanting to understand and being ignorant towards it, because that person that I talked about earlier had no interest in the LGBTQ, because she was convinced that the only sexualities are he, him, and she, her, and that the only gender identities are male and female, and the only sexualities are gay, lesbian. And I mean, there's nothing I can really do for people who don't care and don't want to listen about it. But those who are trying, it goes back to don't sound like an ass when you're asking. Because, like I said, it's a very sensitive time, and sometimes people can overreact. But But if somebody does start going off on you, just take a step back and calmly say, I'm not trying to offend you, I'm honestly asking. And just be as calm and, not condescending, be as calm and as open-minded as you possibly can, and be sure to convey that feeling towards them so that there's no reason for them to blow up on you. Any other questions?
Thank you very much. Nice job.